If you're looking at this image of a spider and you get uncomfortable, sweaty, maybe your heart starts beating faster, chances are you have a phobia of spiders. But what exactly makes something a phobia? Why do we have them? And most importantly, can we do something to get rid of our phobias? Let's find out. When I was growing up, I always had this irrational fear of spiders. It wasn't that I just didn't like them, it was an actual phobia. We had this basement, and I remember seeing a big spider once behind the freezer we had down there. I didn't set foot in that basement for years. If my parents asked me, I refused to get stuff from the freezer. I felt like the moment I would walk down the stairs, it would just start raining spiders, and they would crawl all over me. Fear in itself is actually not a bad thing. You feel fear in order to protect yourself. Fear has helped humans and other species survive for thousands of years. With a phobia, however, this fear turns into something irrational and becomes an obstacle in your daily life. You'll do whatever you can to avoid situations that will trigger a fear response. And when a phobia has so much influence on your life, that can be very hard and challenging. A person might be afraid of wasps, and that's completely normal because they can sting you and that hurts. But this fear could grow into something irrational. And at some point, this person might not want to leave their house at all during spring or summer when wasps are outside. At that point, the fear is interfering with normal life and is now considered a phobia. There's a lot of different phobias, and a phobia can basically be anything, like globophobia, the fear of balloons, pogonophobia, the fear of beards, or nomophobia, the fear of being without your mobile phone. Some of these might sound funny, but for a person experiencing these, the fear response is exactly the same and as severe as any other phobia. We classify phobias into 3 different categories: specific phobia, agoraphobia, and social phobia. Specific phobia is the fear of an object or situation, and there are 5 subcategories within this type. The fear of animals, like arachnophobia. Fear of the natural environment, like thunderstorms for example, which is called astrophobia. Fear of blood and needles, hemophobia. Situational phobias, like being in an enclosed space, which is called claustrophobia. And other phobias. These include the fear of falling down, the fear of loud sounds, and a fear of costumed characters such as clowns. The next one is agoraphobia. This is the fear of being in situations where escape might be difficult or help wouldn't be available in case something goes wrong. Most commonly, people think it's just a fear of being in open spaces, but that's only a part of it, because the person feels like there's no easy way to escape a crowded or open situation. Someone with agoraphobia might be scared of going to a shopping center, taking public transport, or even leaving their house at all. The last category is social phobia. This is the fear of social interactions or situations, and more specifically, the fear of being embarrassed or judged by others. People with social phobia can get intense anxiety for weeks leading up to a big social event. They might also be afraid to be in the center of attention or do certain things in front of other people, like eating. Stanley Rachman was a psychologist who worked primarily with obsessive-compulsive disorder and anxiety disorders. He proposed 3 different pathways for a phobia to develop: classical conditioning, vicarious conditioning, and informational acquisition. Let's go over all 3 of them, and we'll start with classical conditioning. You might have heard of this one, and that's because Pavlov studied classical conditioning in 1897. His experiments with dogs are very famous, and I'm sure it'll ring a bell with most people. Every time Pavlov fed his dogs, he would also ring a bell. And after a while, the dogs started to associate the sound of that bell with food. Later, when Pavlov rang the bell, the dogs started drooling. Even though there was no food nearby, the dogs had a so-called conditioned response. A conditioned stimulus, in the case of Pavlov it was his bell, plus an unconditioned stimulus, in the case of Pavlov again it was the food, equals a conditioned response, the drooling of the dogs. In the case of acrophobia, or the fear of heights, the conditioned stimulus is height itself. You might be on a balcony or on top of a building. The conditioned stimulus is what sets off the fear response at that specific moment. The unconditioned stimulus can, for example, originate from a traumatic event that happened in your childhood. Maybe you almost fell down a cliff. So, being on a balcony, the conditioned stimulus, plus a traumatic experience in the past, the unconditioned stimulus, now equals a conditioned response. You might get dizzy, start sweating, and your heart rate might go up every time you are standing on a balcony, even though this balcony has nothing to do with your traumatic childhood experience. Height, or in this example the balcony, has become for you what the bell became for Pavlov's dogs, a trigger for a certain response. The other way Rachman proposes is vicarious conditioning. This means that you learn to fear something, not by experience, but by watching others, like your parents. For example, if a child sees a parent respond fearfully towards a certain animal, the child can also become afraid of that animal. And the last path is that of informational acquisition. This means you might learn to fear something by receiving information. For instance, you can fear snakes after reading they can bite and poison you. When people with a phobia are exposed, nearby, or even just thinking about their phobia, it causes extreme anxiety that is often irrational and out of proportion to the actual threat. They'll start sweating, shaking, and the heart rate goes up. Let's take a look at what happens inside your brain when you have a fear response. Your brain is constantly scanning all the information it gets through your senses. The thalamus is kind of the processor of your brain. Information comes in through the senses into the thalamus. It then gets sorted and sent to the cortex. This is the rational part of your brain, so this is when you become aware that you are looking at something. If there's a threat, however, or something you've learned might be a threat, the information is directly passed on to the amygdala. The amygdala, which is named after the Greek word for almond, is responsible for processing fearful or threatening stimuli. It means that this tiny nugget will scan for threatening cues around you and act upon them before the signal reaches the conscious part of your brain. If the amygdala feels like there's a threat, it sets off all the alarm bells in your body, and it will initiate a so-called fight-or-flight response.
Oh my God! Okay, it's happening. Everybody stay calm. What's the procedure, everyone? What's the procedure? Stay calm! Wait. Everybody calm down!
Your heart rate goes up, pupils dilate, you start sweating, and the cortisol hormone is released into your bloodstream. This is a perfectly normal fear response. It's meant to keep us alive and escape crucial situations without thinking about it. From an evolutionary standpoint, it's better to be startled by a garden hose, only later to realize it wasn't a snake at all, it just looked like it. In case of a phobia, the amygdala can set off these signals in situations that are, in reality, not life-threatening. But that doesn't mean that the fear or anxiety the person experiences isn't real, because that is as real as it gets. The good news, however, is that a phobia in most cases can be treated. Some people simply grow over their phobia, and instead of having an extreme and irrational fear, they are able to deal with their fear in a much more rational way. And of course, you can always contact a mental health professional to help you manage your specific phobia. Exposure therapy and cognitive behavior therapy are the most effective forms of treatment. Exposure therapy focuses on changing your response to the object or situation that you fear. Gradual and repeated exposure can help you manage your feelings of anxiety. Cognitive behavior therapy is aimed at changing the way you think. It helps you realize that this extreme fear and anxiety is, in fact, out of proportion. It helps you rationalize the fear so you're able to deal with it with a much clearer mind. I hope you thought this video was interesting. I definitely found it very interesting to make, and in the future I'm going to be making more videos about subjects like this. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.